Is there a problem with doing your own research? Should the government reward reporting hate? And is getting a good president as simple as making the financial incentives large enough? We'll discuss these questions and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through our social media feeds, gather takes, and we dissect them here on the show. My name is Britt, and I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe. You can find us on Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. And without further ado, let's get into the first of these takes. So we've got an article. The headline reads, "Doing your own research is a good way to end up being wrong." This is written January 17th, 2024. And a portion of the article reads, "There's probably another factor at play, one not measured in the research. People who believe false claims often do so because those claims comport with their broader ideology or philosophy. Like a parent confronted with allegations of misbehavior by their child, those individuals would presumably be more likely to embrace dubious information supporting their belief than information that corroborates the allegations. The study presented participants with news stories to evaluate without a predisposition. In the real world, that usually doesn't happen." What do you think?
This is a case where it's both. The headline and the conclusion of this whole article is a terrible, bad, awful take. The sentence or the justification, the reasoning here is actually spot on. It is correct. And here's the thing. I'm not claiming that everyone who does their own research is going to be right.
Yes.
That won't happen. But the problem is that this exact justification he gives, where when you find information that is going to conform to your own worldview and you accept it, that is true not of people who do their own research only, but also of the people who put their faith in institutions. So yes, there will always be misinformation out there. There will always be people who want to accept what they're predisposed to believe, but you have to take it in perspective. Is it more or less dangerous to have someone who's going to, quote, do their own research and try to look up things and try to find out dissenting views? Or is it better for people to just accept the broad narratives of people in charge and in authority who have the exact same incentives to create misinformation? This is a two-way street, and the way that I see it is, at least in one, you have people who are trying in some way, shape, or form to have a critical analysis. They're trying to do their own research and investigate things, rather than the other side, which even if they're both guilty of, the other one is just lying down and saying, I'm just going to accept whatever the authorities say, because that is what my worldview agrees with. And if you're saying this in 2024, you clearly have missed the last 4 years that have gone by. Everything about COVID that they told us was wrong was right. Everything they told us about COVID that was right was wrong. They contradicted themselves multiple times. And the people who, quote unquote, did their own research again and again are being proven true. And that's not true in every single case, but it is true enough to the point where it feels like this is just a moot point for him to say. It's like, oh yeah, everyone can be wrong about things when they choose information that is, when the information they evaluate is more aligned with their own worldview than with the facts. That's true of everyone. And if your biggest takeaway is that the people who did their own research are the dangerous ones, you completely miss the plot of what happened with the biggest civil rights takeaway of our lifetimes and how they got it wrong at every single turn. So if both sides are going to be wrong, maybe let's not default to the one that strips people of their freedom.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. What's funny about people who say, like, doing your own research, like there's this almost like this kind of like picture that's painted that doing your own research is, oh, I'm talking with someone as I get my hair cut, at the haircut place. And I'm talking with the barber and he's telling me like, oh, I heard, by Jimmy down the street that, the COVID eats your brain or whatever. And like, oh man, that's my own research. But it's like, no, like most of the people who did their own research that had contrarian views to the established views were doing their own research by reading articles by other researchers, like actual researchers that have the same credentials that all of these different establishment folks said you have to have in order to do good to do good analysis. And I'm not saying that you have to have those credentials to do good analysis, but that's still the irony of it, right? Is that it wasn't actually a matter of whether or not the research and the thoughts and the data were from people that were doing the right thing or not doing the right thing. It was from the same type of people that were giving different points of view. And that's leads you to the conclusion that when there's a big issue that a lot of people have an opinion about, like there's going to be different types of conclusions and things that you take away and different types of analysis, probably as many as there are people in the world. And usually when you have like a situation where there's going to be lots of different opinions and you want to get to the heart of the matter without, while limiting the amount of personal bias and, confirmation bias that occur by trying to find things that have your own beliefs and things like that in them. You want to have as much information out there being analyzed by the most amount of people as possible. And one of the most amazing things about the internet is that now makes that possible at scale. And it made me think of when Shia LaBeouf did that, He Will Not Divide Us, like live webcam thing. And it kept getting taken down by people on 4chan and Reddit. Like they would find it and then they would, make fun of it or they do something funny in front of it. And so he eventually just raised a flag that said, he will not divide us, talking about Trump, in some nondescript city with just a skyline. And the internet literally analyzed the star patterns. They coordinated someone to drive around honking their horn in each city, trying to find the exact location. And it was just the most amazing thing to see the He Will Not Divide Us flag get pulled down and then a Pepe the Frog flag get raised up. So funny. But that's the power of the internet, right? You've got millions of people, sometimes even billions of people, all feeding into aggregate knowledge sources where everyone can kind of look at it and be like, okay, based on everyone's experiences, what they're seeing, the data that they've looked at, all the different types of analysis that exist, you can kind of come to your own conclusion with the best available set of data. And it's always driven me crazy to this might have been somewhat more, not even all the way true, but more true 300 years ago when you could only get the latest information you could get would always be on a 3-week or 4-week leg because it traveled by horseback and it was written down. But today you have almost instantaneous access to it. To say that one scientist in one corner of the world knows more than the internet is just crazy. That's a crazy thing. There's no chance that one single person knows more than the internet at any given point in time. And now, of course, you're saying, you can be wrong by the conclusions you draw from the internet. But I think people are going to be more likely to get to the right conclusion quicker by having all that information aggregated together. And so, doing your own research feeds into that aggregation, and that's a good thing.
Well, and especially to your point, especially when there are direct consequences that impact you when you do your own research, that's another powerful motivating factor that isn't mentioned at all. If, for instance, if doing your own research in has such a strong incentive negatively against you personally, then you're going to feel that really quickly. Whereas the institutions in power that people just want you to sort of blindly offer your deference to because of their quote unquote authority, those often have ways to insulate themselves from the consequences of being inaccurate and being wrong. So think about all of the people who paid a price for the being wrong about Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction. It's not the people who lied us in, not the places of authority. It's the taxpayers. It's the people who were killed innocently in Iraq. It's the soldiers who were sent over there and have lifelong PTSD or commit suicide or have horrible, care from the VA after that. All of the people, all the shareholders who just blindly trust authority, they're the ones who get stuck with the bill when they're wrong. Whereas when you're doing your own research, usually it's going to be over things that are going to impact you directly. So if it's with COVID, for instance, if your conclusion is, hey, ivermectin actually might help me out here. And let's say ivermectin was this horse paste or horse dewormer, as the lie went, then those people are going to be the ones paying the price for it. So there's not an incentive to have that be spread nearly, and the consequence is a lot more direct and immediate. And the consequences for shutdowns were pretty direct, were pretty immediate. But two things happened. The people in authority had to cover themselves and try to cover their butts. So they sent out, a kick the can down the road stimulus check. And two, they didn't have any incentive to, let people return to business. They weren't the ones going out of business, and so they weren't responsive. So it was terrible on both fronts there because of the reactive and responsive nature that they didn't have, whereas people who do their own research generally will have. Another thing that you had said earlier that made me think about it was, when you started out, you were talking about the perception people have about what it means to do your own research. And I remember, if you ever watched College Humor back in the day, Jake and Amir, they're two comedian guys that I followed Amir on TikTok a long time ago. And I remember he had this TikTok that made me so annoyed and irked. I don't remember, this was probably like 2 years ago or something. And he was making fun of this idea of doing your own research. He's like, people are like, oh, I'm going to do my own research. And he's like, really? You have a lab in your house? You're going to like study the microbes and skills? And to your point that you were saying is, it's like, no, that's not what people are doing. They're going to other scientists, other resources. And their points would be so much more salient if the powers that be weren't trying to shut down any dissent from equal voices, right? How are you supposed to trust the authorities that be when they're literally just silencing people who disagree with them, not on the rational basis of disproving them with facts, but by trying to discredit, trying to defame, trying to literally stifle their findings from being distributed? That should not lend yourself any extra credence and authority. And so the last thing I'll say before I wrap up here is another point in this article. They talk about the danger of how people will try to find sources, and when they give themselves a proper name, people will just give that with authority, even if they're just spreading unconfirmed rumors and stuff. And that's true. That can be a thing, absolutely. But how much more dangerous is it when an institution that is given de facto authority by mainstream media outlets, by government power, all those things, are spreading misinformation and untruths? Because now it's not just a name that makes it sound official, it's a name that makes it sound official and has a big enough power play in society because the media gives them credit, because government officials give them credit, or because they're literally part of the government to have power. When those people are deceptive, then it's even worse, because people will buy it because they know, quote unquote, that they have authority. And the moment we need to have is a moment where, yes, you do your own research. You don't take things uncritically. You don't just accept authority for authority's sake, while still giving deference to people who may be experts, but still evaluating those against everything else. I think we would be a lot better place if people didn't just say, oh, well, that's a Harvard-trained X, Y, and Z. If they said, oh, he's Harvard. Well, maybe Harvard's a bad example because of the recent days, but you get the point.
Yes.
He's a Harvard-trained person. Maybe I should listen to him, but his claim here, I still need to evaluate. I still need to make sure that it's corroborating with other people who are in similar positions. How does it clash against this idea that this researcher presented? Because to me, this researcher from a no-name school seems to have a compelling point that argues all of the facts and data against what this Harvard person says. That doesn't mean that we completely discredit anyone who has training or authority, but it does mean that you still weigh things out and do your own research. Also, last thing, credits to Shia LaBeouf. He was going through a rough phase. He's actually now joined the Catholic Church. He's had a whole awakening, so good for him.
Yeah, I didn't mean to hate on him if he's been doing good stuff.
I've dunked on him so much, so I feel like I have a duty to say, hey, he was in a rough place and he's coming out of it. So good on him.
That whole scenario was just hilarious to me.
It really was.
It was very internet-y. But to your point, credentials are a factor in validating whether or not something is good research or good points or anything like that. But it's probably the least important, and maybe at best it gives you pause to be like, hey, maybe this person has these type of credentials. Maybe they have something very interesting to say. And then once they start saying what they're saying, and if the arguments kind of pan out, then you can kind of validate like, oh yeah, that was good. But unfortunately, a lot of the people that did have the credentials, and what's really funny, like that YouTuber that you're talking about says, oh, did you have a lab that you were looking at the microbes with a microscope that was $800,000, and stuff like that. So it's like, no, I don't. And guess who also didn't?
Yeah.
Like, Dr. Anthony Fauci didn't. You know what Dr. Anthony Fauci did? He looked at the same studies that we all had available. He probably had access to studies that we did. I mean, he obviously did have access to studies that we weren't able to see. But then once those studies later came out, it was like, how did you draw your conclusions from this and make the policy recommendations? Even though he says he didn't make policy recommendations, he definitely did. He enjoyed being on TV and telling America what they were supposed to do and whether you could or could not go join your family for the holidays. He enjoyed doing all that stuff. And after we've all looked at the data, it's like, man, it's kind of crazy and cringe that you arrived at the conclusion. Tell us how you arrived there. Like Dr. Rand Paul did a fantastic job asking him, like, how did, basically more or less in a very hostile way, but in a good way, like, hey, how did you arrive at this conclusion? You recommended we do masks. Masks appear to be theater. Tell me how you arrived at the conclusion to recommend it. And the guy was never able to answer any of those. And so when your arguments and your credentials can't stand up to scrutiny, then yeah, your research that you did is wrong. And that's the ultimate proving ground of whether or not research is good or not, is if it can stand up to arguments from someone who doesn't agree with you. And so the benefit, like I was saying earlier about the internet, is that you can get all these arguments out really quickly and also have it evaluated by many people. And they can present their own arguments for it. And we can hopefully arrive at the best conclusion through that.
Yeah, absolutely. If it were up to these people, you wouldn't do your own research, so you wouldn't look back on the congressional hearings to hear Fauci contradict himself over and over again. It's like that actually would be doing your own research to say, hey,
yes,
this week he's saying this. Let's go back a month ago to the last hearing and listen to what he said there. Oh, can't do that. That's your own research.
Yep, exactly. All right, let's move on to the next one.
Ooh.
All right. So, headline SB 5427 to provide up to $2,000 for people to report their neighbors for, quote, hate crimes and bias incidents, unquote. Like any dollar reward offered by the government, the bill would create a financial incentive to report hate or racial incidents, even when there is no evidence that a violation has occurred. The bill would create an atmosphere of suspicion in which informants may simply report people they don't like to get them in trouble with the attorney general and cause a public scandal. Imagine what this would do to confidence in public schools. Students could use the hotline to report other students or to report provocative statements made in class by their teachers. The bill would create a financial incentive for people to judge each other, creating a suspicious and hostile environment in classrooms, workplaces, and in the community. Expand a little bit upon this. Is this here in Washington?
Unfortunately,
oh,
it is.
No.
As of we're recording this, my coworker who wrote this is from a legislative memo from Washington Policy Center. My coworker Lee Finna is testifying before before the legislature against this bill. This is crazy. This is literally setting up a financial incentive for people to report. And here's the crazy thing. Not only hate crimes, but also these bias incidents. Bias incidents don't have to hold up to the standard of law.
No.
So, for instance, it doesn't have to be a crime even in order to get this thing reported. And up to $2,000 reward. What do you think money does? Money is not like this nice little, oh, I did this good thing and here's a nice little bonus. It is an incentivizer. It creates incentives for people to do things. This is literally setting up an environment in which you are supposed to spy on your neighbors, report and tattle on your family, on your coworkers. It is wild. And there's not even a mechanism in here for people to defend themselves. It's supposed to be in an anonymous database, but we all know that when the government has information, if it benefits them, it will either leak or it will be released and used punitively. So this is an absolutely horrendous bill, and it is the antithesis of free speech environment, and it literally is the government incentivizing people to curb speech actively, or it will have the chilling effect of preventing people from being able to speak freely if they so choose.
Dude, that is terrifying. I mean, the bill is a bad take. The writing is a good take, yes, just to get that out of the way. And the critique of this bill is a good take. But it's like 1984. And I always got annoyed at people like making references to that because it seems like kind of the go-to and everything. But this literally is like, there's that chapter in the book where Winston's neighbors, their kids, report their parents for wrongthink, and they're hauled off and they're in the, the reconditioning, jail thing. And it's like, yeah, this is exactly what that is. And it's like, think about the type of people, like $2,000 is a lot of money, but it's also like compared to someone who works for a salary, like it's not enough money to potentially make that person, betray their neighbor and potentially send them to jail. And I don't see, I'm trying to read through the bill a little bit here, but
I don't think it's a jail punishment. I think it's literally just collecting a database of these kinds of things.
Oh, it's just a database. So there's no punitive things.
As far as I know, but it's
I
just
mean, it
kinda
will be
creepy.
though, right?
Right,
Like
that's
it
the creepy
always,
thing. Yes,
it
exactly.
always leads to that. I mean, that's the first thing I thought was like, okay, it's going to be punitive, but yeah, okay, so they're not saying it's punitive right now. So it's even worse because it's like, oh yeah, you're just doing a good thing and everyone wins because we're making a database of all these bad people and you get $2,000. It's like, oh my gosh, it's so bad. And what I was trying to say to my other point, regardless of whether or not like they go to jail or anything, like someone who is generally doing well and minding their own lane is not going to be persuaded. Maybe they will be now because it seems like everyone's a winner in this scenario. But like the people that are going to be most incentivized to take advantage of this are the people that are most desperate. And what is desperation plus dollar incentive equal? It usually equals some form of, hey, I'm reading into things at best. At worst, it's like opportunistic. It's a moral hazard. I mean, it's one of the first precepts you learn about economic fallacies in an economics class in college is moral hazard. Like, hey, if you make a bus free or you make it so that it's hard to collect tolls, like you're going to have a lot of people that are free riders, and that's a moral hazard, and people are going to take advantage of that system. How do you, and like what's awful about this, in addition to that, is the person that is being reported on potentially and being like added to the database. It's their taxpayer dollars that are probably going to pay this person who does not really contribute in a net way to the tax base. I mean, you and I agree we don't like any sort of taxes, but it's even, to add insult to injury in that way.
It's flabbergastingly evil, really. The fact that they would do this with a monetary incentive. I mean, it's one thing to set up this whole institution to begin with, which I think would also constitute evil, but to set it up in a way that actively creates incentive means that not only are you liable to have people set this up and sort of make things up, but it reorients the entire cultural thought process of someone to say, hey, this thing just happened. Was that racial? Can I spin this to be racist? Not only are you thinking about it and dwelling on it being racially focused more, which I would already argue is a bad thing to do, but now you are actively incentivized for it to be racially motivated. So for instance, if someone cuts you off in the freeway, that your thought there should probably be, wow, that guy's rude, or wow, that person's a bad driver or impatient. But now your thought is, wow, did he cut me off because I'm black? Or wow, does he have a thing against, was that because he thinks he's better than me as a Mexican? Or any number of things. You are now incentivized to think about things in those ways, in those terms. And the same way that the focus on DEI and all of that type of thing has created a culture that is obsessed and focused on race, instead of moving beyond and healing and stuff, all we do is hyperfixate on these issues and jump to conclusions about it being the motivating factor. And I think that puts everyone in a healthy frame of mind. It's kind of like, if you do the whole social experiment like they did with the school children, where they told, I don't remember if it was eye color or something, but they told basically they divided the class in half from like hair color or eye color, or maybe it was even just like group 1 and group 2, and they told one group, you are superior to the others. And then people just acted and treated them like that way after, like a month, and they had to stop the experiment. It was so bad, even though they didn't do anything. They didn't give any justifications for it. It's like when we create ways in which you say, hey, racism is here, and here's an incentive for you to view things through this lens and to blame everything on that. All you're going to do is heighten that. You're going to create the monster you're looking for. And so this to me is nefarious in so many ways, but it has horrible speech implications. It has horrible betrayal implications for communities and trust and things like that. But to me, just incentivizing people to look for racial outcomes and things is also just a heinous thing to do.
Yeah, like I think I've shared about this before on the show, but I had a friend in college. He's a good dude, but he had a little bit of, well, I'll just tell the story. So he's black, and he was in a checkout line at Target, and at Target or any store that has self-checkout lines, they usually have one person that is watching all of the self-checkout kiosks. And so, anyways, he was checking out, and he noticed that the checkout person was kind of looking at him and verifying that he had a receipt and everything. And he proceeded to post on Facebook about how he's like, yeah, this is just evidence that racism exists. This person was eyeing me as I was checking out. It's like, bro, that's their entire job. Like, their whole job is to check receipts. I mean, next time you go to Costco and you try and leave, like, they check your receipt both when you're like buying the stuff and when you're leaving. That doesn't mean that they're racist or anything like that. But unfortunately, at this point in this person's life, he had been inundated with like, oh, well, you can't get ahead if you're black in America, or any sort of inconvenience, or any sort of person that is mean to you. Like, look at it through a racial lens. And that's not to say that it's not always, it can't be the case that a certain bad experience you have with another person that might be white or a different color than you could be because of the color of your skin, or because of a racist purpose. But in general, that shouldn't be your default, especially in Washington State. But because he'd been inundated with that type of worldview, anytime he experienced anything, he looked at it through that racial lens. And how much more would he be incentivized to do that if there was a dollar amount attached to it? If he could go to the attorney general and say, hey, I was at Target and this no-name, kiosk security person was eyeing me, and I think that's bias, and you get rewarded $2,000 for it, the next time you're at another kiosk, you might be inclined to do it again. And it's not indicative of whether there actually is hate crime or bias incidents. It's only indicative of a person's incentives. Just like we talk about all the time, like the market and money and all those things it create incentives, and incentivize behaviors.
Yeah, well, and think about it. Even if like that could ruin that guy's life. Even if there's no alleged action. I mean, you don't think that let's say a particular report happens. I would not be surprised if the government alerted like a business, hey, one of your employees had a racial complaint filed against you. And then that is going to basically force the business to crack down on people's behavior, on their actions. Do you think that's good for people? Do you think that if they find out what it was, that person probably gets fired for nothing? Like, does this create a better society or a worse society? It clearly creates a worse society. The people who are doing quote unquote hate crimes or have bias incidents, they're not gonna stop because of a $2,000 incentive for people to report it, because it's not a rational worldview to have a racial bias, right? That's not, people don't operate rationally speaking. The only people that you punish really are people who want to speak freely, expand the worldview, and all this is a matter of controlling how people express themselves and how they think.
Man, so when is this like up for vote, or it's like in the Senate right now, or
yeah, it's being heard in committee, so that's my coworker will be testifying against it. Whether or not it moves out of committee is yet to be determined. There was a similar bill, not quite this bad, but there's a similar bill last session that would have penalized speech about insurrections or something really stupid like that, and it did not move out of committee. There was enough outcry. We also testified against that, so hopefully something similar happens here. But the fact that it's even come to the point where elected officials are introducing this legislation is scary. Because even if it doesn't move out of committee, it means the idea is not so laughed out of the House that it is brought up by people who have positions of power. And that's not a good thing.
Yeah, man, that's wild. I'll have to keep track of it. I haven't heard anything about it until I literally saw it on this show. So
yeah,
man, I'll have to track that. There was another, I mean, the lawn mower bill and so many terrible things in Washington State.
Dude, there's so many bills, it's hard to keep track of them. It's like that's why you haven't heard of it. It's not because it's not noteworthy. It's because there's so many bills being presented, and so many of them are bad.
Yeah, victory through volume.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, moving on to our next one. We got Mike Solana, and he writes, pay the president $500 million and watch how fast the most talented people in the country start to run. What do you think? Would this work?
I wish it would, but to pretend that like the presidency doesn't already get you power and authority, or to pretend that like the presidency isn't tied into massive donor interests and corporate control already is a very funny idea, right? Like as if it's this institution that, oh yeah, anyone really who wants to can run for it, and there's no polls and pressures and pawn pieces moving or anything like that. I think all this does basically is it gives the corporatist major players even more incentive to make their moves, to rig things, to I think it just creates an incentive to control that one position of power more by the people who would benefit from a $500 million salary being in the hands of an individual who would be likely to help them behind the scenes. I don't think it would have the effect, unfortunately. It seems to me like you're fighting fire a little bit with fire here, in that the government is the institution of power, and you know, I think that that's enough of a draw for bad people already. And the most talented people in the world, they don't necessarily need the $500 million in the same way that the person who wants the power already wants that power. I don't know. To me, it just seems like one of those things where the better solution is clearly to remove the chain of power than try to incentivize the right person to take control of it.
Yeah, I don't even think the incentives really line up with the type of person you'd want to be in power. Like,
yes.
Like I think to read into this take, this guy thinks like, hey, like if we properly compensate someone, someone that would effectively run, a $10 billion company, it'd have to be a lot more than that. It'd have to be like a $300 billion a year company in order to be compensated $500 million a year. But let's just say, or I guess maybe it's over the 4 years or whatever. But like, let's try and get someone to incentivize that type of person and draw them to the White House. Like the skill set that he's trying to get is someone that can generate value, someone that wins upon merit. But in our opinions, like all political positions are not based on merit. They're based on popularity. They're based on, how you can persuade as many people that you are the right person for the job. And as we've seen, this persuasion and the ability to convince people has very little correlation with the actual ability to get things done. And so a person that could generate 500 million, they would have to be more, $300 billion worth of value, and that has that skill set and that type of merit, they would not actually have the skill set of being able to get into the White House. It's like you can't actually have both of those things because they're diametrically opposed in the types of skills and the types of talents that you require. And it's not like we don't already have people that make this amount of money. Like that honeypot is already there. Like if you look up Nancy Pelosi, who is not the president, she was the Speaker of the House, like her net worth, I think, is somewhere north of $250 million, right? So she's like maybe the third most powerful person in the country, second or third most powerful person in the country by political office. And yeah, she already made that much money from her run. She probably has access to a lot more money, and that we don't have visibility on. And she also gets like all these egotistical boosts and things like that. So what draws someone to the presidency is not money alone. It's also these awful power trips and the desire to like leave your mark, which most of the time is, in at least in a political sense, when there's nothing connected to actual value and good results, usually results in wars and death and inflation and your savings being destroyed and value being taken away and given to people who don't deserve it. So yeah, it's this would not work. It would be an absolute disaster, and we just have really rich people of the same ilk that we have today.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. The idea that you would attract the most talented people at running for office to run. Maybe
yes.
You wouldn't attack. Like you think about Nancy Pelosi, she was very good at what she did as Speaker of the House and at campaigning. But was she good for the actual Congress? Was she good for the American Republic? No, she wasn't. But she was very good at doing that particular job, and so she got a lot of financial benefit from that. She got a lot of power from that, and she was good at that job, but that doesn't equate to doing the right thing or being good. And like you said, there's clearly a huge financial incentive for someone to be in that position already. If we were worried about the financial incentives, we have to pretend the idea that like being president doesn't already give you a lucrative career after you're done. I mean, even Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the UN, and then she goes on and does a bunch of speaking gigs and makes just millions of dollars from it. And she wasn't even president. And now she's trying to run. Like, I don't think the monetary factor hurts her wanting to do that already. Like, that's probably why she's already running. And she's already pitching herself in such a way. Do we really think that someone would be better at the job than Nikki Haley is necessarily going to out-campaign Nikki Haley? I don't think that would factor at all. And so, the reason why people would run for the presidency, if it's a monetary factor, that power or that draw already exists for people. They know that once they're done being president, they can do the speaking gigs. You think that Bush or Obama or Bush Sr. Had any money problems after being president? Do you think they couldn't ever just whip out a speech, go to a speaking gig, and just be covered for life? Like that's an absurd notion. Once you get to that level of power and wealth, it's not really there's sort of marginal utility of the dollars you get, right? Sure, people always do want to acquire more wealth, but it's like 500 million at that point if you're already doing well, and if you're already going to have the success from being president. What you make now from being president versus 500 million salary, honestly, probably marginally not that different in terms of the value of what you're going to place on that 500 million. If you can get to the presidency, you have that skill set, and you want the money, it's there for you right now. 500 million might be a cherry on top, but I don't think it's going to create this sensationalistic draw of the most talented people who somehow can outcompete politicians who do this for a living, really, pretend to be effective for a living to get people's votes.
It reminds me of, I can't remember who said this quote or what show or movie I heard it from, but there's kind of one boss, and that's the customer, and he can fire everyone from the CEO all the way down to the mailroom person. And that's great in a business setting, like, because that means that the CEO, the people that this guy thinks he could attract to the presidency with $500 million, like, they are accountable to someone. And in order for them to, produce a ton of value, they've got to make trade-offs. When you get into the presidency, like, the levers that you've got 4 years, and you have customers, whether they want you to be their, supplier or not, and you get to do whatever you want. And so it's just like the realities of both positions are completely different. And because the realities of the positions are completely different, then I don't think that the same people in each of the positions would do a good job. I think that the best, like, CEO could not run the country like he runs his business. Like, it would because it's like, it'd be like trying to say that, like, hey, like, in order for, groceries and department stores to be good, every single one now needs to be run by the CEO of Walmart. It's like, yeah, that doesn't work. Like, the reason Walmart is so good is because they have to compete within a market. And so they're like, hey, there's a niche. It's a large niche of cost effective products and services that we can provide, and they operate within that lane. But the second that Walmart is now all things to all people, and there's no option for any other grocery store, like, that CEO is going to run that company a lot differently. And in my opinion, it's probably going to be a lot poorer. Like, all the people that are supposed to serve are not going to be as well served as they used to be. So specialization, decentralization, making it so that people actually serve niches instead of, forcing everyone else out, leads to actually good outcomes. The presidency and politics in general is opposed to that. And therefore, even if you gave someone $500 million and you had the best CEO that could go in, like, they'd have to run the country like they run their business. But it would still not work because it's unilaterally across everyone. And that's why it makes no sense.
Exactly.
All right, moving on to our next one. We got a Twitter user, and they write, 2 years ago, I was lying flat on my face in the House gallery thinking it was the end. We came so close to losing our country as we know it. We should all tremble when 25% of Americans think the FBI is responsible for January 6th. Speak up when false narratives are repeated.
I like this. This one's a representative, actually, and I just love the we should all tremble when 25% of Americans think the FBI is responsible for 1/6, and it's like, I don't know. Should we tremble, or should we tremble at the fact that the FBI was responsible for setting up the Whitmer kidnapping plot? Should we tremble that the government is taking people who were walking by, who didn't even enter the building, and putting them in prison for, wearing a Make America Great Again hat and being nearby? I think there's probably one thing one of these situations is a little bit scarier than the other, in particular, when there are so many open questions about the FBI's involvement. I'm not going to say that we have definitive proof, but there are a lot of clues that lead us into thinking that, yes, there is some level of FBI involvement. In the same way that we look at the October 7th attacks against Israel, and we don't know that the Israeli government was helping or orchestrating, but you have to wonder, like, how come the most secured border in the most secured location got breached by Hamas in this one area when they've been, when they've had incredible defense around their border in so many ways, and this attack was not particularly sophisticated? In the same way, you should also think, how would this quote unquote insurrection, how would this happen in the same way in the single most guarded area when cops were opening the doors for people, letting them in, and particularly when people who had FBI involvement are getting off a lot easier, such as Ray Epps, where it's like, why did he only get a year of like this, light sort of like wrist slapping relative to other people when he was the one ushering people in? There's a lot of questions. So we shouldn't tremble when 25% think the FBI is responsible. You should tremble at the fact that if they weren't, you've created an institution where people think that. Not that they think that you have been so untrustworthy and so punitive and so disgraceful that that's even a possibility to think. That should be the problem if the FBI is in fact innocent. The fact that we have an institution so corrupt that it's even possible for 25% of people to think that happened is your big problem. Of course, if you actually read about the FBI, if you actually do your own research on the FBI, you should know that they're not only capable, but it is very likely that they were involved in some way, shape, or form, because this is the exact thing they do.
Yeah, it's always funny to me, like how much misplaced respect and like thought on what the FBI is supposed to cover occupies the minds of Americans. And it kind of reminds me of like when Dwight Schrute in The Office finds like a half smoked blunt in the parking lot, and he's like, oh, we got to like escalate this, to the FBI and things like that. It's like, yeah, the FBI like is not this catch-all thing that you go send everyone to, or like that is supposed to be the ultimate arbiter of justice. But for some reason, like a lot of Americans think like, oh, like we need to get the FBI involved. Like that's like the big guns or whatever. It's like we should tremble that they have made that as like a psyop in everyone's brains, that like they have this overarching, the ultimate authority in America. When whether or not like you would specifically say that, like most Americans do think of them that way. And it's kind of like the gold standard of what is right or wrong and whether people should be involved or not. And it's always funny to me how like something like the riots of 2020 in the summer of 2020 with George Floyd, like we had billions upon billions of dollars in property damage. We had dozens of people killed, hundreds, even thousands of people injured, some, with lifelong effects from those injuries, millions of dollars worth of private single mom and pop shop businesses burned down, and like almost no arrest. Like if you want to think of like an overarching authority, what their job should be is like, oh, we should track down those people that committed those acts and arrest them, or at least make sure that those things don't occur anymore. But no, that's not what the FBI does. The FBI is called in when there's a rope that's hung in Bubba Wallace's, NASCAR garage because he thinks that it was probably like some sort of like lynch artifact or like signaling. And it was like, no, there was just the drawstring for the garage door. That's what they're called into. And it should make you realize that they're a political organization. They're not actually, an overarching authority. It would be bad if they were an overarching authority that did their job, because they would get it wrong. And any overarching authority that has that much power, when they get things wrong, it's going to be really, really bad. Now, to bring it all the way to January 6th, like what's crazy is this overarching authority that is supposed to be all-knowing, that is supposed to be the peak of accountability. When asked by Congress people and senators, like, hey, did you guys have FBI agents on the ground at January 6th? And were they also partaking in provoking people to enter the Capitol on January 6th? They'll say, like, we have no comment on that, or we can't share any information about that. You would think that if it was clear, if it was easy, and they didn't have anything to do with it, they'd be like, yeah, we had, maybe they'd say we had agents on the ground, but they were not instructed to provoke or be, false flag perpetrators. Or if they didn't have any people on the ground at all, they'd say, oh, no, we didn't have anyone on the ground. But when they say that, like, they realize that, like, oh, we can't perjure ourselves because it could come out at some point. And this is what I like about 25% of Americans thinking the FBI is responsible for 1/6, is that now there's so many eyes on them, they can't just lie to us. They actually have to, like, kind of fudge it a little bit. They need to kind of give the lawyer answer. Because if they don't, like, chances are it's going to come out. What sucks is that when it does come out, usually people have forgotten about it. Much like all of the COVID stuff, when they were trying to force people to get a shot, force people to not open their businesses, arresting people for going on a run on the beach by themselves. Like, that was all really bad and awful when it was occurring. And obviously, even if it was like justified in like the scale, like let's just say COVID had 100% death rate, and you could like kind of rationalize your brain that it was justified, it was still bad. But if we've zoomed forward, it's like, oh no, they were wrong. Like, they were blowing this up for things that were not actually true. and arresting people. But even then, like, people don't really care. They've kind of moved on. They've forgotten that they did all these awful acts, that they sent helicopters out into the mountains to grab people that were camping when they were supposed to be socially isolating. So, like, when it all comes out about the FBI that they were responsible for 1-6, or at least they had a hand in egging it on, I don't think the general public is going to care too much, unfortunately. Hopefully we can get the percentage of Americans, because I think that's a little bit too low, a lot higher. We got to pump those numbers way up, because the more we distrust the FBI, the more accountable they will be held.
Agreed. And hopefully, by the time they are accountable, they actually won't be an institution at all, and they would be, dismembered and dismantled, which would have been a policy of this next person we're going to take a look at, that is about.
All right, here we go. Dave Smith writes, should I read I'm going to read his tweet and then I'll read the article.
Yeah.
So Dave Smith is posting a Reason article, and he writes, the Reason article writes, I never felt the pull of the Ramaswamy movement myself, besides the authoritarian and just plain kooky elements of his platform. Did I mention that he wants a border wall with Canada? His onstage manner was annoying, like someone had somehow crossed Tracy Flick with Rain Allen Root. If you liked him better than the available alternatives, that surely says more about how dispiriting these choices are than something good about Vivek. Anyway, he often felt more like an unofficial Trump surrogate than a real candidate. Well, now he can be an official surrogate if he wants, and if Trump returns to the White House, he can be the secretary of podcasts or something. That man clearly has a future in the sense that we all do. That's a funny little sentence there. Dave Smith writes about this article. Vivek was unquestionably the most libertarian candidate running in the GOP. Can we get some of this vitriol for Nikki Haley? The demon surging in New Hampshire running on World War III. What do you think about Dave Smith's take on this?
Yeah, well, so the reason why we couldn't even take the full screenshot of the quoted article is because they changed the name and deleted the tweet to make the headline more neutral. I don't remember the original title. Now it's just something like Vivek drops out, because of course Vivek has dropped out from after the Iowa showing, where he got just about 8% of the votes. And yes, there were serious problems with Vivek's platform. Absolutely. I was not a fan of his trade policies that were a lot more protectionist than they should have been. And they're like, a border wall with Canada probably does not make a lot of sense for sure. But the idea that this person has, it feels so smug and so caring about things that generally you hyperfixate on the things that are bad without ignoring all of the things that were incredible about his platform. For one, dismantling the FBI. Two, not getting involved in these overseas wars. Again, I wish he was a little bit better about that when it comes to like China and Taiwan, but at least with Ukraine, even with Israel, his response was better than everyone else running. He talked about actually needing to gut the federal bureaucracies. He talked about, needing to restore the entrepreneurial spirit of the US. There's so many things about his platform that were so much better than everyone else. And Reason, the libertarian outlet, their takeaway is, he was populist, basically. He had some elements of his platform I didn't like. And so now he can just go and be pro-Trump and a little dismissive comment. I think that is just so misplaced for a libertarian outlet. Like, if anything, you should say, look, he was not perfect. He had all of these problems. But the fact that the GOP is moving in that direction is a healthy sign, and we should be moving this way away from the Nikki Haley's of the world and more towards the Ramaswamys. Even if he's not perfect, we can work on the things that Ramaswamy is bad on. You can't work on someone who is just in the tank for the big donors.
Yeah, like, I could understand this from any mainstream corporate press outlet like the New York Times or, the Washington Post. But when you're evaluating from a libertarian perspective, which I think the most basic libertarian philosophies are like, let people be free, don't surveil them, don't send a bunch of our people over to war, and don't do violence. And yeah, there's some populist inclinations within the libertarian movement that are a bit divisive. But those other ones, I think we all agree on. Vivek is better than all of the other candidates on those by a significant margin. He's even better than Trump on most of those. And then the stuff that he's bad on, that you can criticize him on from a libertarian standpoint, the candidates that Reason has hyped up, like Chris Christie and Nikki Haley, are worse on than Vivek Ramaswamy. All of the war stuff, all of the surveillance stuff, like Nikki Haley wanting to set like have the I think it was Twitter, like verified identities. It's like, yeah, like the number one thing that libertarians used to be known for was opposing the surveillance state and the Patriot Act. It's like that thing that Nikki Haley is proposing is like the Patriot Act on steroids. Like, how do you not have bad words for that? How do you not have at least even admiration for Vivek calling that out? Like, in terms of the positions that libertarians hold, he did the most out of all the candidates on the stage to advance those. Of course, we don't agree with him 100%. Even if we agreed with him, like not like 30% of the time, he was still so much better than all of the candidates on stage. And that's at least like worthy of a little bit of admiration and mention that he advanced those types of ideas. Whereas like, I think we covered it like 2 episodes ago, like they really loved like Chris Christie and Nikki Haley, people that would love to surveil us and throw us in jail and do totally are not in line with the libertarian philosophy. And what sucks is like this just makes you think that reason is just controlled opposition or just some weird, like, I don't know, been infiltrated by these folks that fund these types of agendas, and they're not an actual libertarian outlet. I mean, I don't think that they would be doing anything different if they were.
It's crazy because if you want to pick things to hyperfixate on, the things that were central to the campaigns might be the best like one issue ways to evaluate, right? Like I get that, you can't be familiar with every single position of every single candidate, and that you shouldn't necessarily have to go through the laundry list of this candidate believed X, Y, and Z and list every single thing out. Here were the goods, here were the bads in a retrospective piece like this. I get it. But how about focusing on the key elements of the campaign? Because like a border wall with Canada was not his central tenet. Was it a bad idea? Sure. But that was clearly not the core of his message. The core of his message was 2 things. One, it was restoring American identity, which to me is neither here nor there. I think it's probably a good thing. I don't think it's libertarian or not. I think it tends to be more libertarian in the way that he talks about it, with it being about individual, about, he always would say like, family, faith, things that are individualistic in nature away from government. So, not strictly libertarian, but at least libertarian friendly. And the second thing was cutting the bureaucratic state. Those were basically his 2 main campaign things. And cutting the bureaucratic state is one of the most libertarian things that every libertarian group, whether you're Cato, Reason, Mises Institute, or other, you should agree on that at the very least. Even if you're, for some reason, sympathetic to the war in Ukraine, you can at least understand cutting the bureaucratic state. And the fact that you're like, I never got the Ramaswamy movement myself. Like, okay, well, that says more about you than it does about Ramaswamy. And the fact that, like, for instance, they aren't just bashing Haley over the head because her central, tenets to her platform is basically we're strong abroad makes us strong at home, which is just keyword for we're going to keep bombing every other country out there, and we're going to make sure not to rein that back at all. That's basically what she's running on. And I'm not Trump. Like those, like, okay, cool. You're not
And
Trump.
I'm a woman.
Yeah, and I'm a woman. Exactly. Like, cool. You're not those things. But then, like, what else do you bring to the table? I don't know. Things like making everyone register with their government ID to use the internet. Like, I don't know. She doesn't offer a lot other than I'm going to do what the donors want. And that's the thing about her is that, like, her campaign is just the tired talking points that any GOP politician is going to give, and it is ready to change turn on a dime as the donors demand it. So she's not an inspiring person. The central tenets of her campaign are deeply anti-libertarian, whereas the central tenets of Ramaswamy's are mostly, if not deeply, libertarian. To write him off and dismiss him, like the only thing that you could say about him, and if you liked him, is because the other people were worse. It's like, I don't know, man. You probably weren't watching the same guy. I think this reeks of a disgruntled Gen X would be my guess, person who doesn't like the demeanor of Vivek, because I feel like Gen X in particular doesn't like Vivek because, I don't know, they feel like, oh, he's just this young upstart. He's a millennial. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And I don't know. I think there's a bit of bitter resentment from a lot of Gen Xers I know who are very normie on this issue. And that's how this whole paragraph and the whole article read to me.
Like, the reason libertarians are never going to win the presidency, at least maybe in our lifetime. Maybe they will in our lifetime if we can convince a bunch of people. But in this election cycle, they're definitely not going to win the presidency. They're in general not going to win any sort of public office, when they do, it's in very small amounts and at very low levels. And so the whole point of a libertarian outlet, candidate, public figure, publishing house, anything like that is supposed to tell the truth and to expound the philosophy and evaluate every single person that is not part of our philosophy against our philosophy and say, why this is good and bad and all these different sorts of things. So I don't have a problem with them critiquing Vivek on the things that he's bad on. I also don't have a problem if they critique Nikki Haley or anyone else out. But what is a big problem is when they only kind of critique Vivek and then they kind of turn a blind eye to Nikki Haley. Like, you should be the bull in the china shop that goes in and says, hey, you all suck and you all need to be better at this according to our philosophy, and here's why. But it's like you kind of have no point. Like, Reason and a lot of these kind of more liberal, the liberal caucus of the libertarian movement, like, they want to ingratiate themselves to the establishment by having the right opinions about the right kind of people and making sure that the wrong kind of people are, kept out of it. But it's like, you're never going to actually win like that way. You're never going to be liked by them either. So what's the point of you? Like, the whole point should be that, and taking this cliche, like, you should be speaking truth to all of the powers, all around, all of the time. And if you're not, then you're kind of useless.
Right. And ironically, it's the very fact that Vivek would do that. He did. He was that bull in the china shop. I mean, he went harder after Nikki Haley than I think I've seen any candidate go after another. At least, I mean, he was vicious and brutal in the right ways, not on cheap measurements, but on actual data points that matter. That makes him more libertarian than this libertarian article in many ways.
Yes. Yeah. Awesome. Well, with that, folks, we'll call it a show. Thank you so much for hanging out with us, and we'll catch you on the next one.